In today's video, you'll be learning how you can make professional color grades in DaVinci Resolve and in Blender. Color grading can really elevate your renders to the next level and make them look even more realistic than they already do. This is something you can do after you've rendered something, so you can go back into old renders and just improve on them. Before we start, we need to dive into Blender and change some settings and just give you some information about what we're going to be doing. Alright, so here in Blender I've loaded up my scene and this is what it looks like in Blender. And I want to change some settings in order for us to work a little bit better. So these are only simple things, but they will go a long way. So first of all, go over to the output settings, and in here you can see I have 4K resolution, ultra wide, and you can set this to full HD if you want, but I always like working in 4K just so I have the most amount of detail that I possibly can. And then probably the most important part is saving the output settings. For me, I'm rendering an animation, so I have a output folder with an image sequence, and the file format is the most important here. Set this to OpenEXR. This will make sure that it's the least compressed of all of these options. You can also choose PNG, but generally speaking, if you're going to be diving into color grading like this, you would want to do OpenEXR or TIFF. I like OpenEXR because it is a little bit more flexible. So if you like TIFF, you can also do that. It works pretty much the same thing. In OpenEXR, we want to select RGB. If you have an alpha that you want, you can select RGBA, but as you can see here, the background is just black, so for me that will just be RGB. Now for the color depth, which is the most important part about the OpenEXR file format that we want, is our float, which will determine our color depth. Normally, for JPEG, MP4s or anything like that, really usual files, the color depth is about 8 bits, sometimes 10, but most of the times they're 8, and that means that you have about 16 million colors, which sounds like enough, but if you really look at it, that only means 256 gradients of red, green and blue, and that will give you 16 million different color combinations. But as soon as we go over to 16 bits, that number quickly turns into trillions of different colors, and that is what the float half will mean. That is 16 bits. Usually I just export at float full, which means 32 bits, which is even more. That is a bit overkill though, since my monitor cannot even display it, and generally anybody that's going to be viewing your art will not be seeing it. Just going to be optimizing this, so I'm going to tell you to select float half. For the codec, most people will tell you to do DWAA, which is lossy, but it is a little bit better for your machine because the files aren't that big. Personally, I like zip just because it's lossless, so I get the most amount of details that is possible. Alright, and now you are ready to render out your animation. If you are rendering an image, you can just hit render without changing any of this, and I'll show you how that looks. So I'm rendering right now, which should be pretty quick. Then I can go over to image, then save as, and then I can just select OpenEXR here. And then same thing for the color RGB, then for the color depth half, and codec zip, and you can save as image. So don't worry about doing this beforehand, you can just change that later. Alright, and that is it for the segment in Blender. We are now going to go over to DaVinci Resolve. That is the more professional color grading tool, and after that I'm going to go back into Blender and do it in the compositing tab as well, just for the people that want to follow this completely in Blender. But just know that DaVinci Resolve is free to use. So let's get over to DaVinci Resolve. Alright, so this will be the first thing you see when you load up DaVinci Resolve, and this is the cut page of DaVinci Resolve. The only thing we're going to be doing here is loading in clips from our media storage. If you have an animation, you can select all of your frames and load them in here. If they appear individually, what you can do is just Ctrl Z and then go over to this page right here and then drag and drop it in here. I'll show you how you can do that. So let's say I have all of my frames right here. I can just hit Ctrl A to select all of them and then just drag them into DaVinci Resolve right here. And I have all my frames here and they're in sequence. What I can do then is just drag it into the media pool. And now we can head over to the edit page. In the edit page, your footage will show up here. And you can just drag that into the timeline to create a timeline, and so you can preview your video. If you have a pretty slow machine and you still want to be able to play this back properly, like with me, it's pretty laggy right now because I have 4K and 32 bits, so that's completely overkill, but I just wanted to show you how you can problem solve some things that come with that. So anyways, if this is laggy, you can go over to playback and then over to timeline proxy resolution. And you can set this to half or quarter, just so the resolution here in the viewer is the quarter of the file. So mine would be 4K, so this will be 1K right now. And this should make it smoother as well. But with the EXR image sequence, it's pretty slow all of the time. So something else you can do is go over to playback and then render cache, and then set this to smart, which when you play it once, it will start to cache this animation, and the second time it goes over it, it will just be smooth. Alright, so that's it regarding the render cache. Now let's get on with the color grading. So to go over to the color page, you can click on this icon right here, and this will bring you to the color page. And as you can see here, we are working with nodes. And these nodes work pretty much just the same way as in Blender. They are serial nodes, so this should be pretty recognizable. So I'd say we just get started. So one thing that comes with saving your image as an EXR with 32 bits is it might be a lot darker than in Blender because the color space transform is not right. So we are going to be fixing that with one of these nodes, and we're just going to be using the default node right here. So I want you to open up the effects tab right here, and then we're going to be searching for the ACES transform. Alright, so now we have the ACES transform on our node. You can just drag and drop it on and it will apply it to the node. So this is basically like a modifier to a node. Alright, so what we want to do here is for the input transform. Our input transform is AGX, but there is no AGX here. So the closest thing in my experience would be sRGB linear. So we're just going to be selecting that, and that happens to be the very last option. And then for the output transform, we are going to be using Rec 709 because that is the standard for phones, for computer screens, for TVs, for pretty much anything you would normally have as a consumer. If you're going to be making movies for Netflix, you would be using Rec 2020, but at the same time you probably wouldn't be watching this video. So if you're watching this video, you would probably be fine with Rec 709. We can set it to Rec 2020 for fun, and you will see that it's a little bit more desaturated. Alright, so I always like to label my nodes in DaVinci Resolve. So I'm going to right click on this node and click on node label. And now we can just type something in. And I'm going to name this transform, just so it's easy for me to see that this is the ACES transform. I'm going to be placing this all the way at the bottom right, just because this is the last operation we're going to do. And that is because I want to be able to maybe change this later. Let's say if Netflix really becomes interested in this 10-second clip, I can switch it to Rec 2020. We want to add in a new node, so you can right click and then click on add node. And then we want a corrector, which is this node as well. This is basically like the default node. So choose corrector. And now with this selected and pressing shift while hovering over this connection, we could just place it in between. I always like to split up my actions into different nodes. So you're going to be seeing me use very few options in this single node before I go over to the next one. In theory, you could just place it all on top of each other in one node, and that would do the same thing. So the first thing I want to be doing is setting the white balance, which we can do with the temperature and the tint, of course. We can do this manually. But something easier is just by getting this color picker for the white balance, and then just searching for something really white. So something very white could be like the reflections or the clouds. So I'm just going to be color picking the cloud right here. And this will set our color balance to -800. I'm going to label this again and setting this to white balance, so WB, which makes it clear for me that this is the white balance node. And that is the only thing I'm going to be doing in this node. And now I want a new corrector. The easiest way to do this is to press Alt S while having this selected, and this will just add in a serial node. And now we can just immediately change this one as well. And at this node, I want to change the mid detail. So if I look at a place like this, I can increase the mid detail, and as you can see, it kind of changes how much you can see. It's basically like a smart sharpen, if I'm correct in saying that. For the overall image, we can see that here. This is maximum detail, and this is minimal detail. I'm not sure how much you'll be able to see with the YouTube compression, but there is a difference. By the way, for zooming in and out, I usually just press Z, so it snaps to the view. So if you see me doing that, that is the Z button. Alright, so for the mid detail, I usually like setting this at around 20 to 40. For this one, I think I'm going to go for 40. Anything above is really noticeable. Anything below just doesn't make sense to even just do this. Now I'm going to label this and set this to MD, which is mid detail. And now I'm going to hit Alt S for a new node. I'm going to start with placing some effects on here. So for this first effect, I always like to do a glow, which is really noticeable in like Hollywood movies. There's always a lot of glow around everything. It's pretty hazy. That is a side effect of the lens they use. That is a side effect of them having actual mist machines. Or just in post adding in glow. And there's never an image that I color grade or composite that doesn't benefit from glow. We can play with the shine threshold, as you can see here. And I always like setting this pretty low because I want most of this to glow. And then setting the spread to maximum it will go, about right here where it ends. And we can just preview this with and without. So this is without and this is with. And it just adds in a little bit more atmosphere to this. You can change all of these things here, like the gain, so you can make it brighter. You can change the color filter, which will make it colored glow. Usually I just pick white, that looks good in most cases. Unless you have like specific colored lighting, you might want to change this up. But mostly white is fine. And the main values to change here are the shine threshold, the spread, the gain, and the color filter. I'm going to label this, call this glow, and I'm going to hit Alt S, and we're going to go over to effects, and I'm going to search for halation, which is also a camera effect that appears in some older movies, and also if you're working with real film. And it's also an effect that's just added in post, like we're doing here as well. So halation adds in some colored borders to high contrast areas. And you can see that here. If I turn this off and on again, you will see the difference. This is also pretty great in adding in that real camera feel. This is something that a CG camera never does because it's a perfect camera essentially. So adding in halation in post is a pretty good way of making this more real. You can play with the threshold again. I wouldn't recommend going too crazy with this. Just keeping it at the default is fine. And that is pretty much it for the halation. Then I'm going to add in another node. And I'm going to add in the aperture diffraction to this. And I think this node doesn't come free with DaVinci Resolve. But as you can see what's already happening, you might not even want this. You're not really missing out if you don't have the paid version, but it does sometimes work out in your favor. So I've already composited this image and I know I'm not going to be wanting this on here, but I'm still going to show you because in different scenarios this might be really beautiful. But the most important settings to change are the iris shape. I usually set that to octagon or hexagon, and then the aperture size, the blade curvature, and the result gamma, and the scale, and the brightness as well. And you could also add in a color if you want this, but I usually just leave it white. Alright, so that is it for the aperture diffraction. I'm just going to turn this off because I don't want it, but it's always nice to have in the setup. So rename this to aperture diffraction. And now we're going to go over to the color part of the grading. So add in another node, and I'm just going to place this beneath it, just so we have more room, and also to signal that this is the color space. So in this node, I first want to balance our image out, and we can see that in the scopes right here. This will show us how bright our image is and how dark it is. And if you cannot see this, you will have to change the keyframe to scopes right here. and maybe even from parade to waveform. And this will show you all the colors in here with the brightness values. By the way, if you don't have this separate, if they're all in one, there should be a button here that you can click that will move it and split it over here as well. Anyways, for the balance, I'm just going to call this balance first. We're going to be balancing out our colors and our highlights, shadows, and midtones. So the first thing I want to do is start turning these knobs. And as you do this, I want you to look at the waveform right here, because we want to be increasing the maximum range, because we're not really using that. So just push it to the top a little bit, and also keep a close eye on your result. It shouldn't be too bright, but something like this is good. Then for the lift, I want to be pulling this up in this case, because the background is pretty dark, and I want to give just a tiny bit of light there. You probably won't be able to notice like the crease in here, but it is there, and that will do wonders for you. If you have a pretty bright image, I would recommend pulling this down. But what we don't want to do is crushing our shadows, so just make sure nothing is below the 0 mark, and that should be fine. And then lastly, I want to be changing the gamma, and then just kind of spreading all of our data out. So maybe make it a little bit brighter, and then pulling this down, and that will just balance it out nicely. So if we mute this, this is what it was before, pretty dark, pretty just flat. And then if we unmute this, you will see a lot more light, while also keeping it nice and crisp. Something else you might want to do is go over to the parade and check if these are pretty much just the same value. So for me right now, this is all pretty even, so I won't be needing to change any of that, but just know that that might be something you need to do. Alright, so that is it for the balancing. Now I just want to add in another node just before the balance, and we're going to call this creative grade. And this is the node where you're going to be doing a lot of artistic choices, which don't really match up with like the balance we did before, but you can just make a look that you want. Some movies are more blue, some movies are more yellow, some movies are orange and teal. So this is the place where you're going to be doing that. So for like an orange and teal look, that's probably not going to work, because there's not a lot of other colors than blue here. But we can just, in the lift, which is the shadows, we can just tilt a little bit to blue and teal a little bit. And then in the gain, which are the highlights, we can go a little bit to the top left, which is orange. And as you can see, this already gives a little bit of a Michael Bay feel. So that would be, or could be, a creative grade that you want to do. Or you might just want to add in a little bit more contrast, and then a little bit more blue in the shadows, just a tiny bit. And then change the temperature a little bit, make it warmer or colder, and then just see what you feel with those things. You can boost the saturation, but something like 60 could be a thing you could do, or shifting the hue around a little bit. I wouldn't recommend doing that, because most of the time your colors are already pretty accurate after the balance node. And for this planet, you might go for something like this. Then to finish it off, I want to hit Alt S one final time between the balance and the transform, and I want to rename this grain, and then just add in a film grain node, which is only for the paid version of DaVinci Resolve. But if you don't have that, you can just download a film grain overlay, which I'll have a description for in the description, and just put it on top of this image sequence right here, and then just set the blend mode, which is right here under composite, to overlay, and then change the opacity to change how strong it is. Anyways, for me it's a little bit more easy, because I have this film grain node, and I can just set a film grain preview of 35 millimeters, just zooming in, increasing the opacity, and you will see some film grain appear here. When I'm switching between different shots, I might want to copy some of these things over if they match up, and if they don't, I can change some values as I told you while going through this. So for example, for this glow, I might want to change the threshold, or I might want to enable aperture diffraction and things like that. But this is mostly where I start. So if I'm starting out with a new project, this is what I'll do, and I'll just match it as closely as possible to what I want, and then I can reuse it later. So if I were to add in some different renders, like this one right here, which is a little bit more zoomed out, you can see it's dark again because it's 32-bit. If you're doing 16-bit, this probably wouldn't be an issue, but 32-bit, it does this for some reason. And now that we are here back in the color page, we can just, with our new image sequence selected, we can just hit middle mouse button on the other one. And this will copy over the nodes and everything that we did to it. And yeah, that's pretty much it for the DaVinci Resolve part. Now let's go over to Blender and do the exact same thing. Alright, so here we are in Blender, and this is just the default scene that I showed you in the beginning, and this is without any changes affecting it, but we're going to be changing this to look exactly like DaVinci Resolve, just so we have a completely free version as well, since some of the effects in DaVinci Resolve were paid, of course. You can still find workarounds in DaVinci Resolve, and some of the options are free as well. But here in Blender, you have a couple more options, although some of the color correcting things are a little bit less good than in DaVinci Resolve. So there are some pros and cons to both of these. But yeah, let's just go into the Compositor tab. And I'm going to do a viewport composite. So I'm going to go over to the viewport shading tab here, and then turn on the compositor in the camera. Right now nothing happens because we are not doing any compositing, but this will just allow us to get a compositor page here, then click use nodes, and then start seeing how we are affecting the scene without rendering it. I'm also going to choose my second camera because this matches up perfectly with DaVinci Resolve, and then we can compare them later and see what the pros and cons are to both of these. Alright, so the first thing we did in DaVinci Resolve was do a white balance, but Blender doesn't have a white balance node, and it also doesn't come with any options to do this. So we need to kind of improvise. And what I found was if you add in a mixed color node and put it in between the image and the composite, then set the blending mode to divide, which is right here. Then we can just do a color pick with this color picker right here, and that will set our white balance. Pretty much just like we did in DaVinci Resolve. So last time we picked our white balance somewhere right here. So I'm going to do that again. And this will set our white balance. So I can mute the node and you will see the difference. Alright, I can rename this node to white balance. Alright, so the next thing we did in DaVinci Resolve was do a mid detail. But Blender does not have a function for this. So instead we're going to do a sharpen. So search for the filter node and set this to box sharpen, which will add in the sharpening right here. And then we can play with the factor to change the intensity. But as you can see, if we change the factor, it's basically like a cutoff. It's not really mixing in all of these details right here. It's just removing them and then only having them intense right here. So what we are going to do is add in a mixed color node and get our original image before this node and then this box sharpen and just mix them together with a certain factor. And then this factor can be whatever you did in DaVinci Resolve. So I'm going to set this to 0.4 because I did 40 in DaVinci Resolve. Then I can just join these two together and call this our mid detail. The next thing we did in DaVinci Resolve was add glow. So in Blender we can search for the glare node, and then we can set this to full glow and then change the threshold to something pretty low again. We did 0.2 I think in DaVinci Resolve, so I'm going to do that here as well, and then set the size to the maximum, which will be 9, and we can set the quality to high if you want, or low will give you some more range, but it will look worse as well. I think medium will do fine. Next we want to add inhalation, and we need to do that ourselves as well. So I'm just going to grab the original image and I'm going to search for a map range node. In this map range node we are going to be changing the from min to 0.8 or something, and this will create like the threshold. Then after that, I want to add in a blur node and then set this to relative, so it works with other image aspect ratios as well. And then just set one of these aspect corrections to whatever you want, and then change this percentage to something pretty small. Now what we can do is add in a mix color node and then set this to the factor. Then set the top color to black and then the bottom color to red. And now we can mix this back in with the other image. And then set the blend mode to lighten, which will add in this nice halation. We can join these together and call this halation. And of course we can change the intensity with the lighten factor. You can also change the threshold with the map range node. And that's pretty much it for the halation. The next thing we want to add in is the aperture diffraction, which you can also do in Blender, which is completely free. So we can add in a glare node. And if we set this to streaks, you can see we have some nice aperture diffraction going on. And then we can change something like the threshold or the amount of streaks. So set this to a octagon, and then you can play with the fade and all of those other things that I showed you in DaVinci Resolve. Alright, so after this, we want to be going over to our color balance node. So add in a color balance node right here. And then we have the lift, gamma and gain that we are familiar with now. And we can start guessing what we need to change based on this image. Because we don't have any vector scopes, we have to eyeball this, so we can increase the exposure on the highlights, play a little bit with the midtones, and then the shadows as well. We can also introduce some color into this, but I want to save that for our creative color grade node. And then we can add in another color balance node, and this will be our creative grade. So we can start introducing some color into these shadows and some color into the highlights as well. And I also want to be able to change the contrast, so add in a brightness and contrast node. Up the contrast a little bit to like 2. And then this will be our creative grade. Then we have our color balance here. And now we can start adding in some film grain. So you can go over to the description again and search for the film grain that I showed you before. So you can just drag and drop that in here. And now we have our grain. If we preview that, you can see our grain here. And now we can just add in a mixed color node and then put this on the bottom. Then set this to overlay, and then we can just change the factor for the amount of grain that we want. And we can just group this together as well and just call this grain. And we don't need to do any color space transforms because we haven't exported this yet. So this is only doing this based on light rays that are coming in. So nothing with like color transforms. And now we basically just have every single thing that we did in DaVinci Resolve also in Blender, and completely for free with some workarounds. If you want to exclude some things like this aperture diffraction, for example, you can just hit M on your keyboard while having a node selected, and that will mute it. And now we don't have the aperture diffraction. And yeah, that is pretty much it. So now we're going to go over to the outro. We'll look at everything we made and we'll compare the two. Alright, so now we are back in DaVinci Resolve, and I'm just going to drag in my Blender grade and just place it on top of this DaVinci Resolve grade that we did before. And if I just toggle it on, we can compare the two. So of course you see a big difference because it's a second time I'm doing it, and I don't have, of course, the exact values in every single program. But yeah, it matches up pretty well with like the glow and everything that we did. It might be a little bit too like bright in the highlights, but we can just easily go back and then just change that in here as well. So that's no problem at all. So yeah, just playing with all of this is a pretty good thing to do. But then again, we did get all of the effects, like the halation. You can see we have the glow, just a little bit less because Blender doesn't really have that big of a glow. And we added in a nice creative grade. And all of those things really result in a nice render. I think you can tell that the DaVinci Resolve grade is a little bit more professional and looks a little bit better, but you might like the colors on this one more. So you can always just go back into the color grading in here and then just do some more creative grading. So that's always something you can still do. So I can match it up a little bit better, do something like this. And that is looking pretty great overall. It matches up pretty well. But overall, I'd say stick to DaVinci Resolve for anything post-processing, because it just feels a little bit better to work with, in my opinion. If that's not the case for you, that's perfectly fine. Just go with Blender. And I showed you how you can create all of the effects. And I'll also leave the file that I used for the post-processing with the compositor on my Patreon and Gumroad, so you can go over there and support the channel for more videos like this. I hope you can tell that I put a lot more effort into this video, and it was also a lot more fun to make. So if you enjoyed this, please leave a like and subscribe so I know I can make more, and also leave a comment with what you want to see next. And that is pretty much all I have to say in this video. I hope you enjoyed, I hope you learned something, and I'll see you in the next video. Goodbye.